Susan Jacoby started her career as a reporter for the Washington Post, was a journalist in Moscow for a couple of years. There's a long history of accomplishments in journalism, and her book of Freethinkers, History of American Secularism, which I've read, was named a notable book of 2014 by both the Washington Post and the New York Times. In February 2010, she was named to the Freedom from Religion Foundation's Honorary Board of Distinguished Achievers, and in 2010, she was awarded the Richard Dawkins Award by Atheist Alliance International. Susan has been known to us for more than a decade, for I think I count something like 14 books here, but the ones most important to us, Freethinkers, A History of American Secularism in 2004, The Great Agnostic of Robert Ingersoll and American Free Thought in 2013, Strange Gods, A Secular History of Conversion, which I found fascinating, in 2016, and going back to 2008, The Age of American Unreason. For reasons that you can figure out all by yourself, she realized she needed to bring the story of the Age of American Unreason up to date because of the world we live in today. So it is the new edition is The Age of American Unreason in a culture, America in a culture of lies. What is there more to say? Get out of the way, John. Susan Jacoby, please.
1978, a writer named Arthur Herzog published a science fiction novel titled IQ 83. In this novel, scientists searching for a cure for mental retardation, as it was called then, make a horrible error in gene splicing and release a chemical substance into the air that lowers everyone's IQ by about 20 points. Of course, what this does is turn the brains of people who previously possessed average IQs into brains incapable of mastering an ordinary junior high school curriculum. And the disease is progressive. No one knows when things will finally touch bottom. Now, this is called the stupid sickness. That's what he calls it. And the plot revolves around scientists trying to provide an antidote before they become too stupid to continue their scientific work. If this talk of mine were an essay, I'd call it the stupid sickness. Because I think Americans are living through something like this now, in which people who haven't become victims of the illness are running around looking for a remedy for the era of ignorance and unreason that we're living through in our civic life, since we acquired a president who can't remember what he said yesterday. And like those scientists in IQ 83, we all have a feeling of racing against time because we don't know where the race to the bottom will end. Again, it's going to take me time to change this because this is a truly, oh, I appreciate that, sir. This is a truly bad setup. Okay, now, I'm going to move back another 150 years. Can you still all hear me? Okay. From Herzog's stupid sickness to 1837, when Ralph Waldo Emerson said in his speech at Harvard, "The mind of this country, aimed at low objects, feeds upon itself." Now, Emerson said this at a time when our young nation was still engaged in building up its intellectual capital. But the words might have been spoken this morning. They encompass all of the elements of our current culture of lies and unreason. the culture that has brought us to our present situation as the most powerful nation in the world, with a president whose motto might as well be ignorant and proud of it. As some of you may know, I see some old friends and fans out there. The first edition of the Age of American Unreason was published in 2008, when a not too well-known senator named Barack Obama and a better-known senator named Hillary Clinton were competing in the for the Democratic presidential nomination. That book was intended as a kind of sequel to Richard Hofstadter's 1963 classic Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. And I was taking a look at the cultural changes, especially those created by the young internet, that, as I saw it, were making Americans a stupider people. Most of the research for the book was done during George W. Bush's second term of office. I viewed what I saw as the anti-intellectual tendencies of the Bush administration not so much as a demonstration of Bush's personal deficiencies, but as one manifestation of a more general process in which dumbness has been steadily defined downward. During the past 4 decades, I wrote, America's endemic anti-intellectual tendencies have been exacerbated by a new species of semi-conscious anti-rationalism, feeding and fed on by an ignorant popular culture of video images, unremitting noise, and increasingly attention span shortened by the digital capacity to provide instant gratification. As I wrote those words, I worried about sounding like a stodgy technophobe. Now, this sounds like a really inadequate Jeremiah. A decade ago, fewer scholars and members of the media shared the intensity of my fears about the impact of technology in general on the public's attention span and level of knowledge. In 2008, I was thinking about YouTube, video games, and the graphic simplification of information on websites when I spoke about our increasing reliance on images rather than words. Digitally driven impoverishment of language, facilitated by texting and tweeting, had yet to extend its cultural reach to all levels of society. Social media were much less influential in 2008 than today, especially when it came to the dissemination and authentication of news. The phrase fake news, in its current meaning, had not been coined, although it apparently was around in England in the 18th century. My book did not even mention Twitter in 2008, which was founded in 2006 and had approximately 1 million users, compared with more than 317 million 2 years ago. I don't have the exact figure for today, but it's obviously higher. In the early years of the 21st century, Twitter was viewed by people over 40 mainly as a medium for the very young. What mature human being, after all, would want to limit communication to then 140 characters? Back then, I know that phrase makes me sound like I'm 150 years old. Young teenagers were people most interested in tweeting. The problem is that people with the minds of young teenagers ought not to be running our country. I believe that serious reviewers in 2008 would have mocked me had I imagined a future in which a presidential candidate or president whose preferred mode of communication is nocturnal tweeting with a large share of the more than now 280 characters taken up by the words fake, wrong, and sad, followed by an exclamation point. Yet in the summer of 2015, I wasn't particularly surprised when Donald Trump took the now famous escalator ride to the lobby of Trump Tower and announced his candidacy for the Republican nomination. He may have been dismissed by certain New York City hairdressers, including my hair colorist, as Le Grand Orange. But I always thought he had a chance to win the Republican nomination. And after he did crush the Republican field, I also believed he had a chance to beat Hillary Clinton regardless of the general election, even though, as someone who's always considered herself a liberal, which, by the way, I'm still proud to call myself, in spite of the fact the chorus on the right saying that liberalism is dead, they wish, and on the left, that progressive is the only proper thing to call yourself as a liberal. I took no pleasure in that premonition. My friends in New York and Washington, most of them journalists and writers, kept telling me I was crazy. Some of them stopped talking to me temporarily as the campaign drew to an end. And I can't say that I blame them for avoiding my obsessive jitters about the presidency, the possibility of a Trump upset of Clinton. The reason I always took Trump seriously was that my rereading of Hofstadter and the research for my own book had made me see Trump, the anti-intellectual candidate, as part of a recognizable pattern rather than as an aberration. When he announced his ambition to exchange the management of his personal brand for the management of Brand America, I was haunted by Hofstadter's precedent warning about the possibility, quote, that there is a possibility that the avenues of choice are being closed and that the culture of the future will be determined by single-minded men of one generation or another, unquote. Doesn't that send chills up your spine? After winning 57% of votes from people with a high school education or less in Nevada's Republican primary, Trump declared, "I love the poorly educated." Providing the poorly educated with an opportunity for a better education, not loving them, has always been the basis of the American dream. But the American expectation, experienced almost as a birthright, that children will do better than their parents, has always coexisted with ambivalence about how much education is too much. Parents don't want their children to be so highly educated that they move completely away from the world of their mothers and fathers. Trump, with his unerring instinct for recognizing and targeting other people's sore spots, was recognizing that ambivalence when he talked about the love of the poorly educated. Now, Trump has frequently been called an unprecedented candidate by television and newspaper reporters, but it was really Trump's 24-hour use of the intentionally truncated tool of communication, perfect for appealing to the irrational, that was unprecedented. Trump's Twitter's now 280 character format is by definition anti-intellectual because it provides just enough room for slogans. It is the modern equivalent of those advertising gems from the Mad Men era. Winston tastes good, like a cigarette should. Or, does she or doesn't she? Only her hairdresser knows for sure. The difference is that most people recognize the old advertising slogans as advertising, while many regard the tweets of a deranged political leader as facts, or in the words of the inimitable Kellyanne Conway, who hasn't been fired today as far as I know when I left my house, alternative facts. The reason for the new edition of this book, and I don't want to take too long because I want to give you lots of time for comments and questions because I know this crowd, you all have them. The reason for the new edition of this book, about 40% of which is material rewritten this year after Trump's election, is that we're all living in a different world than we were inhabiting only 10 years ago. And yet in some ways we can only analyze what's happening today in terms of trends that were indeed evident a decade ago. It is easier to see in hindsight, of course, historians and scholars, much as they would like it otherwise, rarely have the gift of prophecy. The elites, and I never use that term without quotation marks, because elite is a pejorative now, invented by the political right, is often used to describe Democrats, liberal intellectuals, secularists, or both. And I think we've been engaged for the last year in an unnecessary litigation of the 2016 election. One of the questions that inevitably arises in this post-mortem is, how did a nation elected Barack Obama, one of the most thoughtful and well-read presidents in American history, elect someone like Donald Trump, who is without question the least thoughtful and introspective president in American history? I think now that that's the wrong question, and that's what I've come to believe during the last year of research. The real issue is, how do we get from Bush to Obama to Trump? And the answer is that throughout the first 16 years of this century, regardless of who was president, the same social trends have been dumbing down our culture. Our own shortened attention span, which I've already mentioned, was evident in the early 2000s. This is a process, not a sudden change. Many more of us are aware today that the time we spend on digital devices and digital media that are designed to shorten our attention span, that the time we spend is interfering with all of our ability to concentrate. And a lot of us are trying to control. I was talking with people at dinner about this tonight. Our dependency on this media precisely because of our awareness. Who in this room hasn't tried to deal with the glut of disturbing news by limiting the amount of time we spend looking at it? Yet how successful are we really at doing this? You know that every time you turn on a computer or look at your phone, you get the headlines. And it breaks in, creating a kind of continuous mental static in a way that disrupts our ability to absorb information. I'm working on a new book in a room for nonfiction writers in the New York Public Library. And I could have internet connection at the library, but I use an old word processor and carry my work back and forth to my real computer at home with a flash drive, because the fact is I get 3 times as much more writing done when I deprive myself of internet access as I do at home. I can tell myself I'm doing research. Often I need to do research, but how often it ends up in the Neiman Marcus sweater department. I hate to admit this. What should I have emphasized more in 2008? First, the decline of reading. Of course, I should say the decline of extended, thoughtful reading. But things hadn't gone as far then as they have now. You will recall it during the 2008 general election campaign. A lot of people were quite shocked when John McCain's vice presidential running mate, Sarah Palin, could not name a single publication when Katie Couric asked her what newspapers and magazines she read. But there was practically no comment in 2016, actually it was 2017 by then, when in a pre-inauguration interview published by the website Axios, Trump emphasized his lack of interest in lengthy explanations from advisors about the state of the world and the nation. Quote, I like bullets, or I like as little as possible, he said. I don't need, 200-page reports on something that can be handled on a page. Of course not. A 200-page report might offer some information that contradicts what Trump already thinks he knows. He was asked roughly the same question about books that Couric had asked Palin about news sources, and his answer was an even more pointed version of Palin's response. I like a lot of books, Trump said. I like reading the books. I don't have the time to read very much now in terms of the books, but I like reading them. I mean, now we know he doesn't even take his daily briefings. It's amazing. Just before Obama left office, at the same time that interview was published in Axios, the New York Times published an interview with Obama that they had asked for, asking him what books had influenced him as a young man and a president. And, you know, after very lovingly talking about books from Shakespeare to Saul Bellow, he recalled that he said, when I was at school and I was given The Tempest or something, I thought, my God, how boring. He said, but then in college I had a great teacher, and I realized it wasn't boring at all. It was I who was going to be boring if I didn't start to read this stuff. Imagine our president saying that today. The point here is that we had a president who was a reader, but he didn't get unmitigated credit for it. He was often called, you know, not being too tuned into people and politics and too intellectual. How much of that had to do with anti-intellectualism in general, and how much it had to do with his special envy connected with his both being an African-American intellectual, I don't know. But I think that's something that's not talked about very much. Now, I'm just going to, because I want to give you plenty of time to ask questions, I want to ask you to raise your hands. How many of you have ever heard of a group called the American the American Entertainment Software Association? There's nobody here? Not the young cadets at West Point, as well as the older people from the Secular Humanist Society. So there isn't a single person here who has heard of the Entertainment Software Association. Well, now you will. It's a public relations group that represents manufacturers of video games. In 2015, the last year for which figures are available, the Software Association reported that Americans spent $23.5 billion. I'm going to repeat that. $23.5 billion a year on video games. In 2006, the business was only worth $7 billion. 60% of those who spend hours every day playing these games are young men under 30. Now, one thing has not changed since 2008. It's the number of hours in a day. Are people who spend several hours a day playing video games likely to care whether the president reads? I don't think so. I don't think so, since they have no time to read books themselves. I really don't. So, it's hardly surprising that Trump's reading habits did not get covered. You know, when he said he likes the books, but he doesn't have any chance to read them. If people aren't reading, the public isn't reading, why should they care whether their president reads? And so then it's also hardly surprising that Trump's speech also doesn't trouble people. That he has to say something that used to make parents say, that threatened to wash their children's mouth out with soap. I don't know if anybody would even know what that meant today. He has to say something like shithole before anybody pays any attention. But after all, this is a man, and again this doesn't get covered, who also said, I like the words. I don't know why he has this habit of putting the before things like that, but he does. And he said, I have the very best words. The very best word of all is stupid. What does that mean? Lest you think that public discourse, as what used to be considered the highest level, something like a presidential speech that has nothing to do with our lives on a daily basis, has nothing to do with ordinary life. Consider Madonna's comment at the Women's March in Washington the day after Trump's inauguration. She said, quote, to the detractors who insist this march will never add up to anything, I say, fuck you. Fuck you. This march is the beginning of much needed change, unquote. Now, I absolutely agree with Madonna's statement that the marches were the beginning of much needed change. But if we're talking about being real citizens, fuck you closes the conversation. Because the only possible answer to fuck you in personal or public life is fuck you too. This is not a matter of left-wing versus right-wing politics, but of a impoverishment of language that connects to an impoverishment of thought and the relationship between that and the government we have in Washington. A great many pundits are now suggesting that it is a Herculean or an Einsteinian task to distinguish between real news and fake news. This is yet another example of what I call junk thought. All one needs to understand that stories about millions of illegal immigrants voting are fake news is the experience of having voted. You don't need to be an intellectual. You don't need to be a graduate of an Ivy League college. The last time you voted in New York City, everybody who lives in New York knows, you sign your name underneath the name you signed the last time you voted. There is no way that thousands of illegal immigrants could vote at your local polling place. The real issue, of course, is what we can do to arrest and then reverse the progression of a post-truth society. The resistance as embodied by the Women's March is a start, but not enough. This is our civic present if nothing is done to stem the rising tide of ignorance, or our even more disturbing civic future. Liberal intellectuals ought to be talking about their local and state school boards and electing people to them, not about running Oprah Winfrey for president. And I intend no disrespect to Ms. Winfrey when I say that it is a sign of the intellectual difficulties of liberalism and of intellectualism, that the idea to get rid of the ignorant celebrity who's president is with another celebrity whose politics are more congenial to our own. I'd be a lot happier to hear that Winfrey was spending some of her well-deserved fortune on electing candidates to local school boards than I am to hear about another inexperienced person running for the presidency. Then maybe high schools in the state of Texas wouldn't be using textbooks in which the State Board of Education removed Thomas Jefferson from the list of people who supported revolutionary movements and replaced him with Thomas Aquinas. Yes, that's right, Thomas Aquinas. George Orwell, whose novel 1984 has returned to the bestseller list as a result of post-truth fear, wrote an essay in 1946 in which he described the danger in viewing the possibilities of the future as, quote, only a continuation of the thing that is already happening. He called it a major mental disease, rooted partly in cowardice and partly in the worship of power. Trumpism is a thing that is happening now, and what Orwell called a major mental disease is largely responsible for the tendency of too many liberals and intellectuals to act as if it's going to last forever. Not if decent people are willing to invest more time in fighting back. That means not standing up just in a group, but as individuals, calling out one person who makes racist remarks at a dinner table, not just saying something with the safety of a group in which you can be pretty sure everyone agrees with you. It means telling kids that no, they can't have an iPad or a screen of any kind in their bedroom. And investing your own time and showing them that there are other ways to learn. I believe that these next 2 years and what we do during them to take back our country from these evil ignoramuses and to take our own lives from our digital obsessions may be the most important work any of us will ever do. Until we stop aiming our minds at low objects, as Emerson said, we will feed upon ourselves and we will get the government we deserve. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So my question is, one, what could have the Democrats have done better in that last presidential election, and what can they do now?
His question is what Democrats could have done better in the last presidential election and what they could not do now. I don't know what they could have done better in the last presidential election, but I do know what they can do now, and there are some signs I see that Democrats have got to recognize that taking back governorships or the local school board chairmanship or the local city council, that these things are all very important. And I don't think, in fact, I think that is one thing. Everybody tends to talk about just like Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. But the fact, I grew up in Michigan, and Michigan was basically won by 40,000 votes. I think, for example, the Democrats have had a better organization in Macomb County if they had worked on electing school board members and city council members. But there would have been people there whom people knew, who could talk to them about issues. In other words, it wouldn't have been a matter of when did Hillary Clinton visit Macomb County, but local officials whom people knew and who were doing a good job. And I think that's what has to be concentrated on right now. Everything. It's not, for those of us in New York, there's not a lot we can do in that way. But in other parts of the country, there certainly is.
So what you're proposing is that we all leave New York, move to Michigan, and then we can start taking over the electoral college?
What he said is what I'm proposing. We all leave New York and move to Michigan so we can take over the electoral college. No. People in New York can deliver money and volunteer work to people in states where there are, like Pennsylvania, where these things matter. You don't have to leave New York. But I think what we do have to concentrate on are all of these things at the local level is so important. And you don't have to live in Pennsylvania or Michigan to be able to focus on some of those races and realize that if the Republicans, for example, retain control of both houses of Congress, we're in a terrible thing. The Democrats can regain control of one house of Congress. They can at least stop, short of nuclear war, of course, which the president can do. They can stop a lot of the bad things that are happening now for the next 2 years. But no, I don't think the thing New Yorkers should do is move to Michigan. But I think we have to take a strong financial and volunteer interest in those places where the results really matter. They don't matter in Manhattan. My district is going to go Democratic regardless of what I do or not.
I'm from a country where there are 200 political parties. I'm from a country where there are 200 political parties, and each time the party that wins has a coalition of 12 or 13 parties. Is there any hope in my lifetime that I will see that this country will have third party, fourth party, or even sixth party wins, and we can get rid of these first two lesser or greater evils?
He was asking, what country do you come from, by the way? Bangladesh. I knew it. Is there any chance that we're going to turn the country with a whole bunch of parties as in a parliamentary system, as opposed to two? Yeah, you could just as well ask anybody on the street about that. I don't think so, but I have no expertise. Seriously, I'm saying that I have no expertise in that area. I don't think so. I think maybe we could turn into a three-party country, but I don't know, and I would not claim to know anything about that. Ask me about education, ask me about literacy, ask me about public speech. That I am an expert on, but not about whether we're going to turn into a multi-party system.
It seems to me that stupidity and unreason are not the same thing, and that unreason is actually a lot more dangerous. So unreason is, well, maybe one definition is that facts are what I say they are, not what you determine objectively. And Trump is very good at glomming onto facts that many people already agree with, even if they're incorrect.
Yes.
What are we going to do about that?
This is a really great point this guy made, which is that he said it seems to him that stupidity and unreason are not the same thing. And they aren't. They are, let's just say, if you're going to talk about stupidity as lack of intelligence, lack of the ability to understand something like the multiplication tables, there are people who are stupid, but that is not the problem. I completely agree with that. There are all kinds of people who are part of our age of unreason who aren't stupid in the sense that they're not stupid in that they couldn't run a business, maybe, or that they couldn't pass a standard test for admission to college. They're unreasonable in that they don't know how to think logically. They don't want to. They don't. I think a lot of people who are in a grip of unreason not only don't want to think logically, but don't have the capacity for it. For example, one of the reasons I really think that the idea that it's class divisions and tribalism and that people who don't have a college education can't be expected to think for themselves is wrong. I really do believe that reason is a matter of looking at the facts around you, looking at what you see around you, and if you don't know the answer, looking further for it. And that is something that requires a bent for reason as well as native intelligence. And I think, for example, I have suggested in many talks that one of the things that intellectuals ought to be fighting for wherever they live are courses beginning probably in first grade in logical thinking. I think, for example, that very early, certainly not much later than 7 in schools, because kids are already enthralled to the internet by then, there ought to be courses in how to judge things, what things to look for, what do you see in a story that doesn't, and not just taking for granted what you read because it's what you've read before, but other ways to check it out. Reason and intelligence are not the same thing. There are intelligent people who are in the grip of unreason. There are educated people who are in the grip of unreason. And it's not just a matter of as though people with a college education are people who think reasonably and logically. That's not true at all. I completely agree.
The current political situation certainly demands our attention and our efforts. But what happens to secularism? Is that on the back burner now?
I am going to try to sell a piece on that to the New York Times very shortly. I think secularism has been put on the burner back now. We're not seeing many. For example, all of the stories you see about Me Too and sexual abuse and all of these things, they don't mention religion at all. And yet, attitudes toward women, I should say I'm currently working on a new book on women and religion. Attitudes toward women are closely connected with religious attitudes. And the idea, for example, all of the things that are being done now to reduce funds for contraception and women's health care and all of these things, they have their origins in demands made by right-wing religion for many years that did not really go anywhere. Even with George W. Bush, who was a religious fundamentalist, I never would have thought that George W. Bush would look like Pericles, but face it, that's what it looks like now.
And I'm curious, why is it that the secular community has not emerged as a unified political force, and what do we need in order to do that?
It's not at all obvious to me. The religious right has organization, they get their ideas through. We don't. We're just missing something. What are we missing?
His comment is why the secular community hasn't emerged as a force. Did you say religious force? Well, but why the secular community hasn't emerged as a lobbying force? Well, part of the answer to that is simply that the secular community does not have an ecclesiastical hierarchy. John Rafferty is not the Pope. Richard Dawkins is not the Pope, as much as a lot of the religious people writing about it might want to think. None of us have any problem disagreeing with Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins or me or anybody else. So there is something in hierarchy. It's what is wrong about religion. For example, what allowed oppression of women in so many religions, including Eastern as well as Western religions, including polytheism as monotheism. It's one of the things I'm writing about in my new book. The lack of hierarchy, while it's one of our assets to ourselves, is not an asset when we go to Congress. Secondly, in America, in fact, secular lobbies in Europe are quite effective in places like France. In America, because we are a more religious country, there is a shade of brimstone of secularism. And can you all hear me now? Okay, I feel like I'm losing my voice. I wrote a piece for the Times op-ed page a couple of years ago about the reluctance of people to openly admit that they're atheists. You know, the pejorative attached to atheists, which isn't the case in Europe. And how atheists need to come out and not say that they're spiritual but not religious, or not, I really think that, and not use that word. And I received, one of the good things, I have an author website, SusanJacoby.com, and if you want to write me, I answer all my emails. And I received an email from a mother in the suburb of Fort Worth. And she said, that's very well in New York, but she said, you should realize that if my husband and I, they told people they were Unitarians because they felt the Unitarian church was closest to their beliefs, they were atheists. But they said if they told their children to call themselves atheists, that their children would be bullied in school. And I was very impressed by this and realized again that you have to think about how things are not the same. I have no doubt that she was right, but only 2 weeks ago, I received another email from this woman after about 2 or 3 years. She's running for the local school board. She has been affected by the mobilization. That's why I kept mentioning school boards, because what could be better than that, to be moving from lying about being atheist to running for a school board so you can get them to use the word evolution in their high school biology classes. And so I think that's one of the things, that there are a lot of places in this country where there is actual danger in coming out, or the kind of social pressure which, you know, that's something I don't think any of us experience here, but it is something. It's one of the reasons I have it off the website. I think what she said was completely fair.
I was teaching PDX at West Point yesterday about I'm a military historian, about the Enlightenment and the commitment to reason during the Enlightenment. And one of the consequences of that commitment, I think, was the French Revolution and the Wars of Napoleon. Because people got tired of reason and were mobilized by passion. And I'm not convinced that we can persuade the unreasoning people that they're unreasoning. I think that's likely simply to cause a lot of reciprocal passion. And I'm wondering if the secular humanists might find a rallying cry that is a little bit less reasonable and a little bit more passionate, something more on the lines of humanism.
This question about reason and passion, this is a great comment. And one of the things that I believe most strongly is the idea that reason and passion are in some way opposed. That the reason secularists, haven't been able to mobilize effectively is they don't appeal to passions. I absolutely believe that there are ways, that there is such a thing as a passion for reason. Why not? I mean, think about what people have done in the cause of reason. Think about Hypatia, who got hacked to death in the 4th century because she was still trying to use mathematics and pagan philosophy while the Roman Catholic Church was taking over North Africa. What people can invest in the cause of reason is their passion. And if you believe that reason makes a better world, and I do, then I do believe this. It is possible to infuse people with a passion for reason. I think, in fact, one of the things that I say actually in almost every talk to college students is passion isn't just, you can have the same passion for your mind that you have for the person you love, that you have for the children you bring up, that you have for your own future. You can have the same passion for helping people think logically about how we can make a better world. I feel passionate about people not believing that immigrants are stupid drains on American society. And I think there are a lot of ways in which you can talk to people to make them feel that reason, a reasonable approach to every aspect of life is also a passion, and also that you could also talk about in religious terms, sin versus virtue. I was talking to one of the young men from West Point, and I have occasionally spoken to groups which hate the military. They just, they see no reason for any country to have a military. I consider that a completely unreasonable view, and not because I have a passion for the military, or I want to have Donald Trump's military parade, because I believe that a military with civilian control, which our president obviously understands nothing about, is essential for maintaining peace. And having a passion for peace, and having a passion for insane people not running the world, which you can't have without some kind of military power, is right. And I don't think that there is an opposition between reason and passion. I just think that speeches that talk about reason and logic have to be as passionate about reason and logic as people who want to tell you that Jesus rose from the grave after 3 days, and that he's going to be there to judge us at the last judgment have for that. And I don't think that that's impossible to do. I see it all the time when I speak.
So I think we're actually ending our hour now, and I want to first thank Susan for giving a great talk. And for everybody